Hello and welcome to your legislative program, The Gavel, where we look through the activities of federal lawmakers and analyze developments in the National Assembly. I'm Lanre Lasisi, and it's my pleasure to be your guide on this week's episode of the program. I hope you had a memorable celebration as Nigeria marked her 58th independence anniversary. May we celebrate many more years in peace and unity. So, what will we be looking at today? Straight off, let me make it clear that nothing happened in the National Assembly this week. Lawmakers are back in their constituencies, going through party primaries in their bid to have a chance to contest in the elections coming up in 2019. However, we begin with news about the National Assembly. On Monday, the 1st of October, a federal high court in Abuja struck out the suit filed by the Inspector General of Police, Mr. Ibrahim Idris, challenging the power of the Senate President, Dr. Bukola Saraki, and the Senate to summon him over national issues relating to his office. The court held that the suit filed by the police boss constituted an abuse of court process. Well, this may just have paved the way for this issue to be considered when the National Assembly resumes plenary. Let's move on now to what is our major focus today. In the spirit of Nigeria's 58th independence, we sat down with a human rights lawyer, a democracy expert, and the director of the Policy and Legal Advocacy Center, Mr. Clement Nwankwo, to examine how well the National Assembly has developed through the years.
Well, it depends on what period you're looking at, but if you look at pre-independence, we've had the legislature come through several phases of empowerment. There was a time that the legislature existed and wasn't allowed to make legislation respecting certain subjects. Post-independence, you had a full-blown legislature with full powers to legislate on several things. And at independence, we started out with a parliamentary system of government, which meant that executive members of government were also members of parliament mostly. And what that did was create a situation where the parliament had some of its members as ministers, and because of the relationship and the knowledge that existed, there was a whole lot of ability to communicate, a whole lot of ability to smoothen relationships and get legislative and executive collaboration in almost at full steam. The military, of course, intervened, and for several years, the country did not have a legislature in place, and the dictator, General Babangida, at some point introduced a guided legislature, which meant that they were given powers between, I think, 1990 and 92 to legislate on a few things, but it restricted their powers. And that, of course, came to an end when that experiment was terminated. And the coming to power of the dictator, General Sani Abacha, which was really one of the most brutal years of Nigeria's experience. That was full military dictatorship at work. There was no legislature, and the powers of making law was essentially in the hands of the military. In 1999, Nigeria returned to civilian rule, and you had a bicameral legislative system in place, a Senate and a House of Representatives. I would say that since the National Assembly started out in this Fourth Republic in 1999, we've seen ups and downs in terms of accomplishments. The Sixth Assembly, which was the first assembly under this present dispensation, had a lot of what we call positive legislative achievements. And this was especially during the period when President Obasanjo was president. He introduced several of the reform laws that we see in the country today, whether it's on anti-corruption or on the extractive industries or fiscal responsibility and so on. There were a lot of executive-driven legislation that came to pass. But since then, the country has not had an executive-driven legislative process. And you cannot, I make the point regularly, you cannot achieve development where the executive has no legislative agenda. The National Assembly, given the limitations, I think has done very well. They have, in the last two assemblies, written up a legislative agenda, both the House and the Senate, and that's the 7th and the 8th assemblies, have written up a legislative agenda coming from their own initiative of how to achieve reforms. A lot has not been achieved as much as they anticipate because the executive has actually been a major drawback to legislative achievements. And we can look at around us in the world and see governments, when they come in with an agenda. Look at the issue when President Trump came in the United States. Within 2 days of being sworn in, he already presented to Congress the Obamacare repeal bill, and proposed his own legislation. And you can see him driving legislation. Here you have a situation where the executive is completely removed from the legislative process. They have no initiative to come up with bills. They have no initiative that they take to drive reform through the law. And because they don't do that, it means that the legislature has to, in its own creativity, in its own desire to bring about change, drive legislation. And that's not the way it should be. That's not the way any government that is reform-minded achieves anything. And that's part of the complaint and challenge we have. And that's what we should be asking those who are running for office now. What is your legislative agenda? It's not the business, and this is really ironical, it's not a business of the legislature to propose